Hi, and welcome to Diversity in the Community. I am your host, Theresa Harris, and I am so pleased to have with me today, excited to have with me today, a young man by the name of Michael J. Wilson. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Glad to be here, Teresa. Thank you.
Now, I've known Michael since he was a child, and he has grown up to be a very special young man, a very educated young man, very smart young man. But I want him to tell you a little bit about himself.
Okay. Thank you. As you know, I grew up here. After our high school, I went on to college, went to Hampton University, where
Mm-hmm.
I majored in history. And then while there, my journey, believe it or not, took me into the field of archaeology.
Yes.
When I came back from Hampton, I actually had a chance to meet and be mentored by Dr. Warren Perry, who was the archaeological director of the African Burying Ground in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't get a chance. I actually did my undergraduate thesis on the history of colonial New York City, touching on the Harlem, the African Burying Ground in Lower Manhattan. But I didn't actually have a chance to do any of the archaeological work because by the time I met him, most of that work was done. However, working with him, I actually had a chance to study the life of an African prince named Brotier Venture Smith, who was actually died. He actually was lived and died here in Connecticut. His
Really?
cemetery is in East Haddam, Connecticut. He was actually had property in Haddam Neck, which is in between Portland and Middletown, Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
By the time he died in that area, he had over 100 acres of land. They said about three dwellings and over 20 sailing vessels.
Wow.
So,
Wow. And now, is there any in any of our history books in the
um,
schools?
well, no, it's not in the schools yet. That's what we're working on. As you know,
Mm-hmm.
there's really a push to talk about race and diversity and equity, and that's the thing that we look at from an archaeological perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, Central Connecticut State University actually has the only archaeological laboratory dedicated to the study of the African and African diasporic archaeological experience. Um, and that right there, as you know, CCSU is in New Britain, Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also the co-editor of their newsletter called The Sojourner Truth.
Right, right. Now, you're going a little deep for me. Could you say that word again?
The diaspora, which just means the spreading out of people from Africa throughout the world.
Oh,
So
okay.
we
All
call
right.
that the diaspora or the Africana experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay.
So like I said, what we try to look at, and most of our work, believe it or not, on looking at the life of African captivity, we like to use the word captivity rather than slavery for several reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, I like to do the Malcolm X and go to the dictionary. And
Mm-hmm.
so when we go to the dictionary and we look at the linguistical origin, or that's the origin of the word slave, it actually refers to, it's Eastern European in origin, referring to the Slavic peoples. And of course, our ancestors are not from Eastern Europe. Um, so we have to look at it that way. Number two, when we look at slavery, our ancestors never accepted that condition. We've always resisted from the first moment the captives were taken, on the motherland.
Mm-hmm.
There was always that resistance, and not always in the form of violent resistance. And
Mm-hmm.
that's some of the things that we look at from an archaeological perspective to show that it wasn't just white abolitionists who were, moving and advocating for our freedom,
Mm-hmm.
and our liberation, but it was actually our ancestors who were their own agents, in their abolition, and we use archaeology, to disperse and dispense the myths surrounding what are the contributions of our ancestors in this
So
country.
when we are saying, when we always talk about, we always say we were slaves and all that. So that's not the proper thing to say. We were
We
enslaved.
were enslaved, or we were, held in captivity or
Mm-hmm.
in bondage. Because the other thing is, our ancestors never accepted that condition. And when
Mm-hmm.
we accept the word slave, we are actually accepting our dehumanization. So we have to sit down and say, no, we were never slaves. Our ancestors never accepted that condition. And really saying what had happened, we had suffered one of the most traumatic experiences in human history. Not
Mm-hmm.
for days, not for weeks, not for years, not for decades, but for centuries. And we're still dealing with those traumatic effects. you know, we want to talk about terrorism. Well, let's look at the original terrorism. You know, and I mean, when you're talking about taking people from their homeland, you know, to make them work, to make you rich. And this is what we have to look at, like slavery, like when we're looking at slavery and the enslavement of Africans particularly to make people rich, we have to really look at that process. Again, when we look at the African captive experience, even in Connecticut, we have a documentation that as early as 1636, if not earlier, that you have the first Africans, you know, coming even into New England and then in this region by the Dutch. Now we have to look at when the Dutch came, they came over a little bit different. They came over as traders. So they had a different, you know, relationship and a different mentality versus when the British came over and really changed things in 1664. They pretty much took over New York, you know, in that year. Now, prior to that, a man in New York by the name of Simon Congo actually owned pretty much all of where we now know as Wall Street, all the way up to 34th Street in Collect Pond.
Really?
Really. Now, in 1664, when the British came over, first of all, they pretty much had told the Dutch, listen, either forfeit or get demolished. So the Dutch pretty much surrendered without fighting because, you know, the British at this point had become the naval power at that time. And so the Dutch said, hey, you can have Manhattan. And that's when they changed the name of it from New Amsterdam to New York. And Harlem was actually a Dutch community spelled with two A's. And then when they anglicized it, they turned it down to one A. So actually Harlem was spelled H-A-A. R-L-E-M, Harlem. And now when the British took over, it became Harlem, you know, to let them know. And so the Dutch moved to the Bronx and then to Brooklyn. And the British pretty much took over all of Manhattan, changed it to New York. And the key thing is that they created laws which said Negroes, blacks, or whatever were not allowed to own any property. So they pretty much took away all this man's land. And believe it or not, at that time, Lower Manhattan was actually called Little Africa. And that's why you have the African burying ground downtown. What a lot of people don't know is that there are over 20,000 bodies interred in that area right now.
Geez.
So, and the only reason why it came to light is in 1989, I believe, the federal government was putting up a building. The GSA, the Government Service Administration, was putting up a building. And when they started doing the dig, even though people in the community were saying, listen, there's an African burying ground there. But again, because, no pun intended, actually a pun intended, you know, our history was buried beneath the ground. So people just either ignored it, chose not to know it. But then when the excavation happened, you know, people started seeing these bones, and thank goodness there was, at the time, you had Gus Savage, who was a senator at the time, and he said, listen, if y'all continue, there's no more funding. And then also David Patterson, who was the former governor of New York at that time, he was also a legislator involved on the committee, and thankfully we had them there to sit down and demand an investigation and to bring it to the light, to get the funding. And it just so happened that I happened to be in New York at the time working at the Schomburg when they had the Burying Ground Steering Committee, so I was able to get a lot of primary information, you know, on the burying ground, and that what led me to do my undergraduate thesis on the history of the African American experience in colonial New York City. So after I graduated from Hampton, I ended up coming back to Connecticut, did the Hartford thing, did the insurance thing for a couple years, but I realized that right there wasn't what I wanted to do, and I happened to hear about the archaeological director of the burying ground was also working at CCSU. So I actually went one day to sit on his class and tell him what I was doing. I met him, and then we were talking, and he told me that all the archaeological work for the burying ground in New York City had been done, but he had said they had just came across this site in Haddam Neck on Brotier Venture Smith. And, you know, he gave me all this information and said, hey, if you want to be a part of it, here you go. And he gave me all these books and all this information that I had to do a lot of reading on. And Contrary to the popular movie Indiana Jones, most of the archaeology is not done out in the field. 90% of archaeology is actually done in the lab and doing research and in the library.
Really?
Really, believe it or not. So when I was at Hampton, that's where I got my archaeology experience, exposure. The first time I was talking to a professor, and he mentioned getting into probably anthropology and archaeology. Like I said, at the time, the Hampton University has one of the oldest museums in the country dealing with African, Native American, and Asian Pacific collections. And so there was a gentleman who was doing museum studies who was also working at Jamestown Settlement and told me that they were looking for an archaeological intern. And so I spoke to my advisors, and I was able to take that as an independent study and get credit for it. But most of my work was actually done in the lab, and I had to look at the Coates collection, which was a whole bunch of Native American stone tools and projectile points collected from the Tidewater region. Now, the Tidewater region is dealing with the coast of Virginia, like Virginia Beach and Elizabeth City, North Carolina. So this gentleman by the name of Coates actually, as a hobby, just collected all these Native American stone tools and projectile points. So it was my job to look at that time, which I thought were rocks. You know, I had to look at these rocks, and I had to, differentiate. And just for those of you who are out there, they're not called arrowheads. So if you really want to upset an anthropologist or an archaeologist, call them arrowheads. The proper name is actually stone tools and projectile points. And so I had to go through and, look at them and see if they were from late archaic, middle archaic, early archaic periods by their designs, if they were Piscataway, if they were Clovis points, little things like that. I had to look and see if, they were mortars, if they were if it was just straight, as we say, debitage or just debris, and there. So after a while, you start cataloging, organizing, graphing, and seriating the information, and all of a sudden the rocks start to speak to you. They start telling you a story. But at that time, and so it was just amazing to see the process come together. So it's like putting together a big jigsaw puzzle, as we're telling the story. And so, and it's a very important, and who's telling the story. What I usually do is, I always tell when I do my programs and workshop, I always ask the question, when the hunter is fighting the lion, why is it that the hunter always wins? Because the hunter's telling the story. You see, if the lion were to tell the story, I'm sure there would be a different perspective. You see, so you always have to have the understanding. That's why the power of telling your story is so important. That's why we try to use archaeology to differentiate what history says and the records versus what the artifacts and the objects say that are left behind, to see if they match up. Because if they don't match up, then there's inconsistency.
Now, in your workshops, are they mostly adults or children?
It all depends. My workshops I actually do from pre-K all the way up into the adult ed. As a matter of fact, I'm in the process now of working with the New Lots Library in Brooklyn, New York, which actually has one of the highest crime rates in all of New York. Wow. But they actually have a lot of information. You see a lot of Africanisms, a lot of African connections within the community. So we've done some videos. They have actually right in where the library is, they actually have an African burying ground there as well.
Really?
Really. So I mean, over the last, I would say, 2 decades, a lot more information has coming out on the life of African captivity here in the North, and especially in the Northeast, because we're always thinking about the African captive experience, in the South. But believe it or not, right on Route 2 in Colchester, right outside of Colchester in a town called Salem, is actually one of the largest African captive plantations in the country, called
Really?
Yes, owned by the Binghams. The Bingham family. And there are a lot of connections, because Brotier, when he purchased his freedom, he actually purchased his freedom from a man named Abel Bingham. Okay. And we have a lot of connections, because actually one of the descendants of Abel Bingham was Hiram Bingham. And for those in the world of archaeology, Hiram Bingham is known for Machu Picchu. the pyramids
Okay.
in
Yeah.
Peru.
Yeah.
Fast forward a little bit more, then another relative was David Bingham. Now, David Bingham was an attorney who actually represented the New Haven Black Panther Party when they were, going through their ordeals with the FBI and COINTELPRO. So it's amazing the little connections that archaeology and history can bring out. So to get back a little bit to the work on Brottier, Brottier was actually taken as a young boy from West Africa, we believe, which today would be in Guinea. They say when you read his narrative, and I recommend everybody read his narrative, it's less than 40 pages.
Okay.
And he gives an account of his life when he was a child in Africa, his experience when he was taken as a captive, and his journey to manumitting himself. And to me, his life and his narrative is the life of what should have been, And so within the newsletter at the Sojourner Truth, we actually, in 2006, we actually did some work at the request of the family to disinter the body to see if we could get any DNA.
Really?
Really. However, believe it or not, when the world was Pangea, Connecticut and West Africa, New York were part of the same. And so the soil in Connecticut is very acidic.
So kind of like ate everything away?
There you go. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure these things out. So unfortunately, when we did disinter the body, the only thing in Brottier's grave that we were able to find was coffin fragments and nails. So thankfully, he did have a narrative that he reiterated and told, and so I recommend that everybody do read his narrative. I think it should be required reading for everybody in America. Because what I do is I compare his life to a man by the name of Fortune, who was actually a captive owned by a man named Preserve Porter in Waterbury, Connecticut, who was the bone doctor and the bone specialist. And they were pretty much living around the same time. Brottier's life is roughly 1729 to around 1805. Fortune, his life was roughly around the same. Unfortunately, he came to his demise around 1798.
So when you said bone specialist, what did he actually?
I mean, he was just like a doctor, bones.
Oh,
He
okay.
studied
All
bones.
right.
He was the doctor. Now, according to, the story, Fortune, who lived in Waterbury, actually came to, his demise in the Housatonic River. Now, the porter said that that Fortune was like part of the family. However, how many family members do you pretty much, without sounding, too morbid, but I mean, he was a bone doctor, and I'll just put it this way. He used Fortune's bones as his specimens. Now, what makes this even more horrifying and more tragic is that the porter still owned his family, and they kept his bones in the house, and the family still had to see that. And eventually, the bones were actually brought to the Madianic Library in Waterbury, and it was actually called Larry for the longest time, unknown until people actually decided to do deeper investigations. And when we look at the forensics and the archaeology of his bones, you see that this man, had a very hard life. And then same thing when we look at the bones from the burying ground in Lower Manhattan. Out of those 20,000 bones, 40% were women and children. And now, just to put this into perspective with the children, to show you how horrible and dehumanizing this condition was. Okay, the children in the burying ground, many of them, had already had developed skulls. All right? Now, what does that say? Because your skull isn't supposed to fully form bone until you're fully grown, so it can still have time to grow.
Right.
So why is there such bone formed? Because they're having to carry large amounts of weight on their heads. Now, on top of that, their bones were that of little children. So what is that telling us? They're telling us that these children are overworked and underfed.
One more thing. What is multi-vacancy?
Valency.
Valency, okay. And how do you apply it to the N word?
The N-word. Oh, yes.
The dreaded N word.
The dreaded N-word. Okay. Well, multivalency is a term coined by, I believe, Dr. Perry. And it's when the oppressed take an object or a word, as we will use with the word nigger, and give it a meaning that the oppressed use, but that the oppressor do not know. You see, so for instance, it came up really in the African burying ground when we were looking at the graves, where one of the graves, they had uncovered a body that had beads that looked like a heart. But upon further examination, you realize that the beads were from West Africa, and that the heart wasn't a heart, but it was an Africa Adinkra symbol, which meant Sankofa. Now, when we apply it to the word nigger, now, a lot of people don't understand. We have to first of all look at the origin of the word nigger and how does it come about. You know, many people forget that the trade in African captives began with the Portuguese and then the Spanish. And it was solidified by a man by the name of Bartholomew de las Casas. And he made a plea to the Pope, you know, saying that, hey, you know, we can't be enslaving the natives, the Arawaks, the Caribs, you know, or the Tainos, but we have these Africans. So he made a plea to the Pope to sanction the trade in African captivity. And so through there, you have the word, the Portuguese and the Spanish word for black is what? Negro.
Right, Negro.
Now, the major river in West Africa is the Niger River or the Niger,
right.
You know? And so you get Negro in Niger, and then you get the English who come on the scene now, you know. So now you start forming the word nigger, you know, and then that word nigger then begins to take on a dehumanization, you know. But what we have done with that word, and this is up for debate, you know, we get into a lot of debates with this, you know, growing up, you know, we've changed the N-I-G-G-E-R to the N-I-G-G-A.
Right.
And so we say that gives it a completely different meaning, you know, and how we say it and how we use it. So when we talk about the term multivalency, that's an example of how we have that of multivalency in terms of linguistics. You know, how we've taken a word that has so much negativity and so much hurt, and we have given it our own meaning that we use within our own selves. Now, you know, and sometimes now you have white people who feel that they can use the word, you know, or feel that it's this reverse racism, you know, that we can use it, but they can't. But I always say, number one, I have a real problem with the whole concept of reverse racism. You can call me a reverse racist when I go to Europe or any other country and I steal and kidnap, you know, and torture and terrorize these people for 400 years and make them work and then come up with lies and false and myths to come up with their ability to not be human beings, you know, and then create laws, you know, and rules and restrictions to keep them segregated. When I've done that for 400 years, you know, that would bring, and then another 400 years, then you can start calling me a reverse racist. You see?
Yes,
So until then, that's a made-up word, just like white guilt is a made-up word. Yes, you need to feel guilty for the crimes that you've done. You need to be held accountable, and we need to have more leaders to speak up to that. You know, we as a people need to demand our rights, you know, and our humanity. And this is why I tell people all the time, I have a problem going back to the word slave than I do with the word nigger, because as long as people review us as slaves, they don't respect us. And we don't respect ourselves. So until we take agency in our own story and defining who we are as human beings, because believe it or not, under the Constitution in 2016, we are still 3/5 of a person. That's part of the articles. That's article. That's not an amendment. So we need to really talk about Mr. President, who's a constitutional lawyer, having a constitutional revision to really clarify what is our status in 2016 as African Americans and descendants of those in this country.
Are we a whole person yet?
I don't. Well, that's a matter for the court to decide. It hasn't been brought to the court, and that's something that we really need to do. We need to take it to the Supreme Court and ask that question. You know, are we full human beings or are we 3/5? And if we're 3/5, are we still property? And if we're still property, then why are we paying taxes? But that's a whole nother question on that right there.
Michael, I tell you, it has been a treat to have you on. You are a walking, what do I say, history book.
Well, thank you. Well, I did go to school for history.
Uh, I don't know how in the world anyone can remember all of the things that you would, but I have been enlightened. I've
Well,
learned a
thank you.
lot, in just a short time. And I've always enjoyed hearing you talk and listening to you speak anyway, because every time you speak, I learn something new.
Well, thank
And
you.
it's just been wonderful. So I want you to tell the audience how they can get in touch with you. If you have any information that you would like to say to the audience, I would like for you to.
Sure. Well,
Yes.
we're in the process right now of putting together a children and family show called Grill World Harlem. So if you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at grillworldharlem@gmail.com. I mean, at Gmail.
Yeah, you maybe should spell that griot.
Griot World, that's GRIOTWORLD, Harlem, HARLEM, all one word, at gmail.com. And then if you want to see some of the stuff that we're doing, the show is hosted by a puppet named Djeliba, and he's from Jamaica. And so you can go to his Facebook page. It's Djeliba Man. That's DJELIBAMANN, and you can check it out and follow our journeys, and hopefully you'll enjoy it and follow along.
Okay, Mike, thank you so much.
No, thank you,
Thank you for
Theresa, for
taking the
having me
time
here.
and sharing with us all this knowledge. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. And hope to come back again.
Well, I hope you can. I hope you can come back with the puppets.
Oh,
so we
yeah,
can see all
definitely. We'll
that.
try
Yeah,
to bring
yeah.
the puppet, do a show, and, have some fun.
Yes. So thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something today from Michael J. Wilson. Thank you.